The sky was beginning to dim as Sergeant Elijah Brooks drove home from a veterans outreach event, still wearing his army jacket. The crisp evening air filtered through his slightly cracked window. The familiar ache in his shoulder from an old combat injury pulsed gently, a reminder of the years he'd given to his country. Elijah wasn't thinking about war, though. His mind was on his daughter's science fair the next morning and the speech he promised to help her rehearse. That peace shattered when red and blue lights suddenly flared in his rearview mirror. He frowned. He wasn't speeding, hadn't run a light. But he slowed down and pulled over without hesitation, as he'd been taught to do 100 times before. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser, young, tense, and already on edge. Elijah kept his hands on the wheel and rolled down the window. "Evening, officers. Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. But they didn't answer. Their hands hovered near their weapons. One of them yelled, "Step out of the vehicle now. Hands where we can see them." Confused but compliant, Elijah slowly opened the door, stepping out with both hands raised. "I'm a U.S. Army veteran," he stated clearly. "I have identification. I'm not armed." The moment he moved to speak again, one officer flinched and fired. The shot rang out like thunder in the still evening. Pain tore through Elijah's upper arm as the bullet grazed him. He dropped instinctively behind the car door, not in fear but in survival mode. Everything slowed. His breathing steadied. He didn't panic. He assessed. Years of combat training activated like a switch. They hadn't asked for his ID. They hadn't followed procedure. They saw a black man, and they reacted with violence. He didn't want bloodshed, but he wasn't about to die on the roadside. He reached into the glove compartment, retrieving his legally registered concealed carry firearm. He didn't aim to kill. He didn't even want to shoot. But the rules had changed. The officers had drawn first blood, and now, like so many times before, Elijah was being forced to defend his life in a place that was supposed to be home. Elijah gritted his teeth as blood soaked through his sleeve, the burn of the bullet grazing his arm sharp but manageable. He had been shot before, in Kandahar in the dead of night, while protecting his unit during an ambush. This wasn't that. This wasn't war. And yet, somehow, it felt more dangerous. At least in combat, he'd known who the enemy was. Now, back on American soil, it was men in uniform who should have been his brothers. He stayed low, breathing evenly, suppressing the rush of adrenaline threatening to cloud his judgment. He didn't want to escalate this, but he couldn't let it end with his blood on the street and a story twisted beyond recognition. He drew his weapon, not to attack but to warn. From behind the driver's side door, he aimed high and fired 2 controlled shots into the air, the sharp crack echoing down the street. The sudden retaliation stunned the officers. One immediately dove behind their cruiser. The other hesitated, shaken by the disciplined precision in Elijah's response. This wasn't panic fire. This wasn't a threat. This was a soldier's warning. "I'm not your enemy." Elijah shouted loud and clear. "I've served this country longer than you've worn that badge. I'm bleeding. I am not a threat. But I will not be gunned down without cause." His voice was steady, commanding, and it cut through the fog of confusion. Somewhere nearby, a window opened. A neighbor began recording. Sirens wailed in the distance. Backup was on its way. Inside the patrol car, one of the shaken officers fumbled with the radio. "Officer down, possible shooter, return fire," he barked, even though neither of them had been hit. Elijah's face hardened. That lie, those words, were all it would take to justify his death. A man defending himself would be painted as an aggressor before the truth could ever catch up. But then, screeching tires signaled the arrival of another unit. A senior sergeant stepped out, took one look at Elijah, and stopped cold. "Elijah Brooks," he said, stunned. "What the hell is going on here?" That voice recognition cut through the tension like a blade. The 2 young officers looked between each other and the commanding sergeant, their faces paling. They had fired on a decorated Bronze Star veteran. And now, for the first time, they realized they'd just shot at the wrong man. Elijah's arm throbbed with pain, but his mind was sharper than ever. The familiar voice of Sergeant David Mendez, A man he'd once led through insurgent-infested mountains was like a jolt of reality crashing into the madness. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. Recognition. Brotherhood. But beneath it, Elijah saw something else in David's expression: disbelief and dread. "Mendez," Elijah said through clenched teeth, still crouched behind the door of his truck. "They shot first. No questions. No orders. Just bullets." David held up his hand, signaling the surrounding officers to lower their weapons. "Stand down," he barked. "Everyone lower your weapons." The command echoed across the street, but the tension lingered like fog after a storm. One of the younger officers, Officer Callahan, visibly shaken and still gripping his firearm, hesitated. He aimed at us. We were just— "No," Mendez snapped. "You fired on a decorated veteran who posed no threat. He's a Bronze Star recipient. He saved my life in Fallujah. And you shot him like a criminal during a traffic stop?" Silence. The body cams blinked. The neighbors still watched from their porches, phones recording. Every second of this was now public. Elijah finally stood, slowly, his pistol now resting on the hood, unloaded and away from his hand. Blood still trickled down his arm, but his face was stone. "I served this country," he said. "Spent over a decade defending freedom. Came back hoping I'd be respected the same way I respected the flag I fought for. But tonight, my medals didn't matter. My service didn't matter. All you saw was black." David took a step forward, swallowing hard. "We're going to make this right." Elijah scoffed. "You can't undo what just happened. And you can't give back the decades we spend building trust in a system that burns us anyway." An ambulance arrived. Medics rushed over, urging Elijah to sit. He allowed them to tend to his wound, but his gaze never left the officers, especially the one who fired first, Callahan. That officer, barely out of academy age, couldn't even look Elijah in the eyes. David sighed deeply. This is going to be a mess." "No," Elijah replied. "This is going to be a reckoning." In that moment, the streetlights flickered on. The night had only begun, but so had the fallout. And Elijah Brooks, the man they tried to silence, wasn't going anywhere quietly. The next morning, Elijah sat upright in a hospital bed, his arm freshly bandaged, his mind already drafting a plan. The incident had gone viral overnight. Every news station from New York to L.A. was broadcasting the body cam footage, showing the moment officers opened fire on an unarmed black veteran during a routine stop. Hashtags were trending. Celebrities were speaking out. But Elijah wasn't interested in outrage alone. He wanted accountability. His attorney, Yasmin Porter, arrived just after sunrise. Sharp as ever, dressed in a sleek gray suit and carrying a thick folder, she wasted no time. "The footage is clear. They never told you why you were being pulled over. No commands to exit the vehicle. Just shots. You didn't raise your weapon until after they tried to kill you." Elijah nodded. "And the only reason I survived is because I'm trained for worse. But not every black man they stop is." Yasmin's jaw tightened. "We're filing suit today. Civil rights violations, excessive force, reckless endangerment, and we're naming Officer Callahan and his partner, plus the precinct. You think we can win?" Her eyes locked with his. "Elijah, they messed with the wrong soldier." By noon, Elijah walked out of the hospital flanked by reporters. Cameras flashed. Mics were shoved forward. Questions came rapid fire. "Do you think this was racial profiling? What message do you have for the police? Are you pressing charges?" Elijah raised a hand for silence. "I didn't survive combat zones to come home and get gunned down by the people sworn to protect me. This isn't just about me. This is about a broken culture where skin color is treated like a threat. But I'm not here to beg for change. I'm demanding it." The crowd erupted in applause. Activists in the crowd raised their fists. Veterans standing nearby saluted. Elijah didn't smile. He wasn't here for symbolism. He was here to dismantle something rotten from the inside. Later that day, as Yasmin filed the lawsuit, Elijah met with a coalition of veterans and civil rights leaders. Plans were already in motion: town halls, rallies, televised interviews. His service record became a national talking point, a glaring contradiction to the way he had been treated. The system had drawn blood from him. But now, Elijah was drawing a line in the sand, and this time, he wasn't wearing camouflage, he was armed with truth. The courtroom was packed, cameras perched high in the corners, news vans circling the courthouse like hawks. Inside, Elijah stood in his full dress uniform, medals gleaming against his chest, not for show, but as a reminder of who he was, of what he'd survived, of what they'd tried to erase. Beside him stood Yasmin, composed and razor-sharp, flipping through notes while the opposing side looked visibly shaken by the national attention. After weeks of heated testimonies, expert witnesses, and endless attempts by the defense to paint Elijah as aggressive or non-compliant, the final day had arrived. The jury had deliberated for only 4 hours. The courtroom went still as the foreman stood. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." A gasp swept the room. Officer Callahan's face turned pale, his partner slumped in his chair. Elijah stood motionless, jaw tight, but a single tear slipped down his cheek, not out of relief, but from the weight of justice finally, miraculously, tipping in his favor. The judge continued. In addition to financial restitution, this court orders a full federal investigation into the precinct's conduct, past cases, and training protocols. Furthermore, the involved officers are hereby terminated and barred from future law enforcement employment nationwide. Outside, the crowd erupted. Veterans, activists, and families who had lost loved ones to similar brutality embraced one another. Elijah stepped to the podium. But this time, the silence that fell over the crowd wasn't from suspense, it was from respect. "I didn't want to be a symbol," he began, voice steady. "But the moment they pulled that trigger without warning, they made me one. Not just for veterans, not just for black men, but for every American who's ever feared a badge more than a bullet." He paused. "Let this be a message, not just to those who abuse their power, but to those watching in silence. We are done asking. We are done waiting. And we will not be dismissed." Cheers thundered. Flashbulbs fired. The nation listened. Weeks later, Congress introduced new legislation named after him, the Elijah Cross Accountability Act, mandating body cam transparency, racial bias training, and independent civilian oversight. Elijah didn't seek fame, but by standing up, he lit a fire too bright to be ignored. He came home a soldier, but he left that courthouse a symbol of justice reborn.